In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it.
For quite some time now, I've been pouring my energy, my thoughts, and a whole lot of soul into a new musical project, and I'm thrilled to finally be able to talk about it properly here on the podcast. It's an upcoming release, specifically a double album, and it's going to be coming out on vinyl. The title is Truth is Power / Love Kills. The idea behind making it a double album, and particularly on vinyl, wasn't just for the aesthetic, though I do love the aesthetic of vinyl. It's because the music and the themes within it naturally fell into two distinct yet connected halves. This project feels like the culmination of a lot of reflecting, writing, and exploring different musical textures that have influenced me, including, of course, the deep well of the blues. Side A, Truth is Power, the acoustic heart. The first half of the album, which I'm calling Truth is Power, is deeply acoustic. It's where I wanted to strip things back to capture a raw, intimate, and direct form of storytelling. Think of the early acoustic blues players sitting on a porch or in a juke joint, just a voice and a guitar, laying bare the truth of their experience. That's the feeling I was aiming for here. The instrumentation is minimal, primarily acoustic guitar. The focus is entirely on the lyrics and the delivery. These songs were often written late at night, sometimes just a moleskin notebook and a guitar in a quiet room. The creative process for this side was very introspective, pulling from personal experiences, observations about the world, and the relentless pursuit of honesty that the blues demands. Lyrically, Truth is Power delves into themes of confronting reality, personal integrity, resilience, and the quiet strength found in simply acknowledging things as they are. It's about finding clarity in the noise, speaking plainly, and trusting in the fundamental power of truth, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. There's a direct lineage here, for me, to the narrative power of folk music, and yes, the fundamental honesty found in the blues. These aren't polished pop arrangements. They're songs delivered with the immediacy of a whispered confession or a firm declaration. Recording this side was a conscious effort to maintain this raw quality. We used minimal takes, often just letting the performance breathe, capturing the nuances and imperfections that make acoustic music feel alive and human. It was about capturing a feeling, a moment in time, rather than crafting something overly produced. I wanted it to sound like I was playing right there in the room with you. Side B, Love Kills, the alternative electric edge. The second half of the album is titled Love Kills, and this is where the energy shifts dramatically. This side ventures into more experimental, alternative electric territory. If Truth is Power is the quiet contemplation, Love Kills is the visceral reaction, the struggle, the intensity that often accompanies deep emotion and conflict. This half is full band, amplified sound. We're talking electric guitars, driving drums, sometimes distorted textures, and a bigger, more expansive soundscape. The influences here are broader, drawing from alternative rock, heavier blues sounds, and even some post punk or experimental elements. It's louder, more angular, and more sonically diverse than the acoustic side. Thematic elements on Love Kills explore the destructive aspects of love, not just romantic love, but the love of ideas, love of power, the things we hold dear that can sometimes lead us astray or cause pain. It's about internal conflict, external pressures, passions that consume, and the struggle against forces that seek to diminish or destroy truth and genuine connection. There's anger, melancholy, defiance, and a sense of wrestling with darker impulses and societal pressures. The creative process for Love Kills involves more collaboration with other musicians and really exploring the sonic possibilities of amplified instruments. We experimented with different guitar tones, drum sounds, and textures to create a sense of tension, release, and sometimes sonic chaos that reflects the lyrical themes. It was about channeling energy and emotion into something powerful and at times unsettling. Two sides of the same coin. While the two halves are sonically very different, one sparse and intimate, the other layered and intense, they are, in my mind, two sides of the same coin. Truth is Power explores the foundation, the quiet strength of holding on to truth, while Love Kills explores the challenges, the battles, and the potential for destruction when truth is compromised, or when destructive forms of love or obsession take hold. Together they represent a journey through introspection and external conflict, through light and shadow. Making this a double album allowed me the space to fully explore both of these musical and thematic directions without compromise. Putting them together on one release creates a dynamic contrast that hopefully enhances the listening experience, allowing each side to highlight the other's strengths and distinct character. The vinyl experience. Choosing to release this on vinyl was a very deliberate decision. There's something incredibly special about the ritual of putting on a record. It demands your attention in a way digital streaming often doesn't. You interact with the physical object, the cover art, the liner notes, the act of flipping the sides, and sonically there's a warmth, a depth, and a presence to vinyl that I feel is uniquely suited to the music of this album, especially the raw analog feel on the acoustic side and the dynamic range of the electric side. For listeners who appreciate the tactile experience of music and the warmth of analog sound, I believe this album on vinyl will offer the most immersive way to experience these songs. It's about slowing down, listening deeply, and engaging with the music as a complete work. I always had an idea of people listening to my music late at night, hanging out with their girlfriends, or having a quiet evening inside, just lighting one up, laying back and vegging out and listening to good music. I made it for my friends and for me to enjoy, and I hope other people can relate to the vibe I bring. What to expect in getting involved. So, what can listeners expect? Expect honesty, expect musical contrast, expect songs that aim to resonate emotionally and perhaps provoke thought. From the stripped down intimacy of Truth is Power to the amplified intensity of Love Kills, the album covers a wide emotional and sonic spectrum, all grounded in themes of truth, struggle, and the human condition. The album is nearing completion, and I'm incredibly excited to share it with you all. Keep an ear out for more details on this release date and how you can get your hands on the vinyl. I'll be sharing updates on the podcast and through my website and social media channels. For those of you who are vinyl collectors, I surely hope this double album finds a place in your collection. It's been a labor of love, truth, grappling with the things that can kill the spirit, but ultimately finding strength through expression. I'm particularly keen to hear what you, the listeners of Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man, think of this project when it's out. Your appreciation for soulful music and thoughtful storytelling is what makes this podcast community so special, and I hope this album speaks to you. Stay tuned for release details. Truth is Power, Love Kills, coming soon on vinyl. I can't wait for you to hear it. Welcome to Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. I'm Stephen Leake. Welcome back to the quiet corners of the mind. Here on Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. Settle in, and welcome to the second season. Find your comfort. Spark one up if you must. We're delving today into a subject that speaks to the particular and peculiar strength of the human spirit, particularly when pressed against the absolute, unyielding weight of the state. We're talking about truth and lies, and the extraordinary individuals who choose to articulate the former in the face of the latter. Today, we begin to explore the life and work of Alexandr Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn, the name itself carries a certain weight, doesn't it? A sort of gravitas, etched into the granite of the 20th century. He was, by any measure, a phenomenon. A writer, yes, a former soldier, a prisoner, perhaps most significantly, a dissident. Born in 1918, just a year after the Bolshevik Revolution swept Russia into a new, brutal age, Solzhenitsyn's life was inextricably bound to the Soviet experiment and ultimately to its undoing, at least ideologically. He wasn't born a dissident. Few are. Dissidence is often forged in the fires of experience, hammered out on the anvil of injustice. Solzhenitsyn served bravely in the Red Army during World War II, reaching the rank of captain. But even amidst the patriotic fervor, his private correspondence revealed thoughts, critical thoughts, unapproved thoughts about Stalin and the regime. In February 1945, while still on the front lines in East Prussia, he was arrested by the Smerch counterintelligence agency. His crime? Daring to express, in private letters to a friend, veiled criticisms of Stalin's conduct of the war and the regime's totalitarian nature. Think about that for a moment. Letters, words on paper, exchanged between two people, enough to shatter a life. His sentence was 8 years in the Gulag, the sprawling, brutal network of Soviet forced labor camps. This was followed by an internal exile. It was within this harrowing system, this archipelago of suffering, that Solzhenitsyn's perspective was forged. His resolve hardened, and the seeds of his most powerful writings were sown. He wasn't just a witness, he was a participant in the state's cruelty, a victim of its paranoia. So, who or what is a dissident writer? It's a title earned, not given. It's more than just disagreeing with the government. In authoritarian societies, where the state controls information, dictates narrative, and punishes deviation, a dissident writer is someone who refuses to adhere to the official line. They challenge the state's monopoly on truth. They speak or write uncomfortable realities. They bear witness to the suffering the state denies or perpetuates. They are, in essence, enemies of the manufactured reality. In the Soviet Union, this was a particularly perilous path. The state, under Stalin and his successors, maintained absolute control over all forms of media, publishing, and artistic expression. The official dogma was known as socialist realism, a style that demanded art and literature serve the aims of communism, depicting Soviet life not as it was, but as the party claimed it should be. Any deviation, any hint of criticism, any exploration of individual suffering outside the glorious collective narrative was deemed anti-Soviet propaganda. Censorship was ubiquitous, pervasive, and often absurdly strict. It wasn't just about banning overt political critiques. It was about controlling thought itself. Writers had to navigate a labyrinth of prohibitions, constantly aware that a single wrong word, a misplaced comma even, could lead to backlisting, loss of livelihood, or worse. The Union of Soviet Writers was not a guild of artists, it was an instrument of party control, enforcing conformity and policing dissent. The power of the written word in a silenced world. Why literature? Why did writers become such potent figures of resistance? And why did the state fear them so profoundly? Because in a society where public discourse is strangled, where history is rewritten daily, and where individual experience is invalidated by official lies, literature becomes a last refuge for truth. It offers a space, however clandestine, for authentic human experience to be recorded, for memory to be preserved, and for alternative perspectives to be explored. Think of it, when newspapers are mouthpieces, when radio is propaganda, when history books are fabrications, where do people turn for a sense of reality? Often it's to smuggled transcripts and manuscripts, to whispered poems, to stories passed hand to hand. Literature in such contexts ceases to be mere entertainment or intellectual exercise. It becomes vital. It becomes a lifeline. It validates the experiences of those the state wants to erase. Dissident writers like Solzhenitsyn understood this. They wrote not for fame or fortune, though those things sometimes followed, often posthumously or in exile. They wrote because they felt compelled. They wrote because the truth, in their view, demanded to be told, even at immense personal cost. They wrote to bear witness, to remember, to defy the enforced amnesia of the state. Solzhenitsyn's experiences in the Gulag provided him with a wealth of material, but more importantly, with an unshakable moral authority. He had lived through the system's core mechanism of control and punishment. When he wrote about the camps, he wasn't speculating. He was recounting brutal lived reality. His most famous work, One Day in the Life of Ivan Dezinovich, published initially in 1962 during Khrushchev's brief thaw, offered the Soviet public its first unvarnished glimpse into the Gulag from the perspective of an ordinary prisoner. The impact was seismic. It ripped a hole in the carefully constructed facade of the Soviet state, revealing the rot beneath. Khrushchev himself authorized its publication, perhaps as a tool in his de-Stalification efforts. But even he couldn't foresee the full implications of unleashing such raw truth. Ivan Dezinovich was just the beginning. Solzhenitsyn continued to write, often in secret, storing manuscripts, trusting friends to hide them. His work became part of the underground network of self-publishing and distribution of censored materials in the Soviet Union. Copies were typed, retyped, carbon copied, and passed from person to person, a silent chain of defiance circulating forbidden ideas. Later, his works were smuggled abroad and published in the West, a phenomenon known as Tamizdat, publishing there. These foreign publications then often found their way back into Soviet Union, creating a feedback loop of forbidden knowledge. The act of writing itself became an act of resistance. Every word put down was a refusal to be silenced. Every page hidden was a small victory against totalitarian control. For Solzhenitsyn and others like him, the pen truly was a weapon, perhaps not against tanks or armies, but against a more insidious enemy, the lie. They aimed to dismantle the lies the state told about itself, about its history, and about its people. Setting the stage for reflection. As we embark on this journey through Solzhenitsyn's life and works, I want to invite you to consider the profound courage it took to be a writer in such a world. We live, for the most part, in societies where expressing dissent, however unpopular, is largely permissible, protected by law. We can publish articles, write books, criticize leaders, protest policies. It's easy to take this for granted. But imagine a world where every keystroke could be monitored, every conversation overheard, every written word a potential indictment. Solzhenitsyn's story focuses and forces us to confront fundamental questions about freedom, truth, and the individual's responsibility in the face of tyranny. What is the moral obligation of the artist, the writer, the thinker, when their society is built on falsehoods? How does one preserve one's integrity when surrounded by pressure to conform? What is the true cost of silence? We will explore his major works, like the Gulag Archipelago, the monumental literary historical investigation that exposed the full horror of the Soviet camp system to the world, a work so devastating in its detail and scope that it shook the foundations of Western communist parties and intellectual sympathy for the Soviet regime. We will look at Cancer Ward and First Circle, novels drawn from his own experiences that offer searing critiques of Soviet society and the lives of those trapped within it. His journey was not a simple linear progression. He was persecuted, expelled from the Writers' Union, awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1970, which he initially didn't travel to Stockholm to accept for fear of not being allowed back, and finally, in 1974, arrested, stripped of his Soviet citizenship, and deported. Exile did not silence him, though. His views and later works in the West became controversial in different ways. His legacy is complex and debated, but what is undeniable is his pivotal role in tearing down the wall of lies that surrounded the Soviet state. Piece by piece, with the sheer force of his prose and his personal testimony, he was a man who saw unspeakable evil and chose to write about it, not just as a historian or a journalist, but as an artist, imbuing the facts with the weight of human suffering and the clarity of moral judgment. So let the contemplation begin. The air is still, the light is low, and the echoes of a voice from a time of repression challenge us to remember the power of a single truth, bravely spoken, or in Solzhenitsyn's case, courageously written. The life and works of Alexandr Solzhenitsyn. We touch briefly on the outline of the man's journey in our introduction, from decorated soldier to state enemy in the blink of an eye. His life was a brutal, hands-on education in the true nature of the Soviet system. But let's dig a little deeper into that trajectory, because understanding the crucible in which he was forged is essential to understanding the fire of his writing. From front line to Gulag Island, Alexander Ivanovich Solzhenitsyn was born in Klusatovsk, Russia, in 1918. His father died before he was born, killed in action in World War I. His mother raised him in difficult circumstances after the revolution. He was a bright student, excelling in physics and mathematics at Rostov State University, while also studying literature by correspondence. He began writing stories and poetry early on, but the path of a writer under Stalin was fraught, requiring adherence to the party line, which even his youthful idealism must have struggled with on some level. Like many young men of his generation, he answered the call when Germany invaded in 1941. He served with distinction, rising to the rank of captain of artillery. He was a patriot, fighting for his country, but even war, with its life and death urgency, couldn't entirely suppress a mind trained to observe and critique. It was during his time on the front that he exchanged those fateful letters with a friend, Nikolai Vidikovich, and they discussed the war, the future, and quietly, carefully inserted veiled criticisms of Stalin, whom they referred to by a pejorative nickname. Words, remember, just words on paper, exchanged between two trusted individuals. In February 1945, his military career ended abruptly. He was arrested, interrogated, and sentenced without trial to 8 years in the Gulag under Article 58 of the Soviet Penal Code, the catch-all article for counter-revolutionary activity. His specific charge was paragraph 10, anti-Soviet propaganda and agitation, and paragraph 11, organizational activity directed to the preparation or commission of counter-revolutionary crimes. His organization was a friendship. His propaganda was private correspondence. So began the long descent into the archipelago. From 1945 to 1953, Solzhenitsyn experienced the full spectrum of the Gulag. He was initially sent to a transitional camp, then to a series of forced labor camps. He worked in various capacities, from common laborer to eventually finding work in a special prison camp near Moscow. These Shashrakas were paradoxical institutions, research and development facilities staffed by imprisoned scientists, engineers, and intellectuals, exploiting their skills for state projects like military tech. It was a slightly less physically brutal environment, but one where the intellectual and moral compromises were perhaps even more acute. His experience in the camps were horrific, transformative. He saw human depravity, resilience, despair, and unexpected flashes of grace. He witnessed the systematic dehumanization, the crushing labor, the starvation, the cold, the capricious cruelty of guards and criminals alike. He contracted cancer during this period, a tumor that required surgery and radiation treatment after his release, an experience he would later write about. These years weren't just a period of suffering, they were for him a profound education in the nature of totalitarian power and the human capacity to endure or collapse under it. They stripped away illusions. They revealed the stark truth of the state's relationship with its citizens. It was here, in the depths of the Gulag, that the voice of the future witness was forged. After serving his full 8-year sentence, Solzhenitsyn was not freed, but sent to an internal exile in Kokturek, Kazakhstan in 1953. Stalin died shortly after his arrival in exile, marking the beginning of a slow, uncertain thaw. It was in exile, teaching mathematics and physics, that he began to write in earnest, initially in secret, composing prose and poetry he memorized or buried to avoid discovery. He was finally released from exile and rehabilitated in 1956 during Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign, following the 20th Party Congress, where Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crimes. The literary onslaught, exposing the system. His experiences were not merely personal tragedies. Solzhenitsyn saw them as microcosms of a national catastrophe. His writing became his means of bearing witness, of telling the truth that the state desperately tried to suppress. He felt a profound moral obligation to document the suffering and expose the lies. This sense of mission fueled his work. One Day in the Life of Ivan Dissident. This novella was Solzhenitsyn's literary debut, and its publication was nothing short of miraculous. Approved by Khrushchev himself, it appeared in the leading Soviet literary journal, Novy Mir. It was the first time a work openly depicting the reality of the Stalinist labor camps was officially published in the USSR. The story follows a single day in the life of Ivan Dezinovich Sukov, a simple peasant unjustly imprisoned in a Gulag camp in 1951. The narrative details the relentless struggle for survival, the meager food ration, the freezing cold, the constant vigilance required to avoid punishment, the small victories, the petty cruelties, and the underlying desperation and resilience of the prisoners. The significance of Ivan Zinovich cannot be overstated. It was a punch to the gut of the Soviet myth. While not depicting the absolute worst horrors of the early camps, it showed the system as a place of grinding hardship, injustice, and human degradation, not the re-educational facilities the state claimed. For millions of Soviet citizens who knew people who had vanished into the camps, or perhaps suspected the truth, it was a validation of their fears. For those who had managed to believe the propaganda, it was a shocking revelation. It generated immense discussion and controversy, both within the USSR and internationally. It immediately established Solzhenitsyn as a major literary voice and figure of immense moral authority. It was a calculated risk by Khrushchev, intended to buttress his anti-Stalin campaign, but the Pandora's box was open. Once the reality of the Gulag began to enter public consciousness, it was impossible to fully close it again. The Gulag Archipelago, published 1973 to 1975. This is Solzhenitsyn's magnum opus, a towering monument to the victims of Soviet repression, described by the author as a literary historical investigation. Rather than a straight historical account or novel, it is a monumental 3-volume, 7-part work detailing the history, structure, and operation of the Soviet forced labor camp system. It is based on Solzhenitsyn's own years in the camps, the testimony of over 200 fellow prisoners he interviewed or corresponded with, and his extensive research into the history of repression from the Bolshevik Revolution onwards. The Gulag Archipelago systematically lays bare the entire system, the arbitrary arrests, the farcical interrogations and show trials, the horrific journey in prison train, the diverse types of camps, labor camps, political camps, criminal camps, exile settlements, the slave labor, the hierarchy among prisoners, politicals versus criminals, the methods of control, the sheer scale of the operation, and the millions who perished within it. Solzhenitsyn argues that the Gulag was not a perversion of the Soviet system, but an intrinsic and essential part of it, a tool of the state, control, and social engineering used from the very beginning of Bolshevik rule. The impact of the Gulag Archipelago was devastating, particularly in the West. While many scholars and journalists knew about the camps, Solzhenitsyn's work provided an overwhelming, irrefutable, and deeply human account. It arrived at a time when many Western intellectuals still held sympathetic views towards the Soviet Union or were willing to downplay its human rights abuses. The Gulag Archipelago made such positions intellectually untenable for many. It provided the definitive comprehensive indictment of the Soviet state's systematic use of terror and imprisonment against its own people. Its location in the West in the early 1970s was a major factor in changing global perceptions of the USSR and contributing significantly to the decline of communist ideology's appeal outside the Eastern Bloc. Creating this work was incredibly dangerous. Solzhenitsyn wrote it in secret over many years, hiding manuscripts and trusting parts to friends who risked their lives to safeguard them. A typist who had copied parts of the manuscript was arrested in 1973 and, under KGB pressure, revealed the location of one copy. This forced Solzhenitsyn's hand. He authorized its immediate publication in the West. The first volume appeared in Paris in December 1973. The Cancer War, 1968, and The First Circle, 1968. While Ivan Dissident offered a glimpse into the camps and the Gulag Archipelago, dissected the system itself, novels of Cancer War and The First Circle explored life outside the harshest camp walls, but still under the pervasive shadow of the Soviet state. Based on his experiences in a Takshin cancer hospital after his release from the camps and his time in a prison, respectively, these novels are powerful social critiques. Cancer Ward uses a hospital ward as a metaphor for Soviet society, with patients from various walks of life confronting mortality and the failings of the state-run healthcare system. It delves into their past, their moral compromises, and their uncertain futures, exploring themes of illness, death, love, and the search for meaning in a controlled environment. The cancer itself can be read as symbolic of the rot and lies infecting the entire system. The first circle, named after Dante's Limbo, the least severe circle of hell, suggesting life in a prison camp is preferable to the camps, but still a form of imprisonment. It's set in a research institute populated by prisoner scientists. It depicts the moral dilemmas faced by intellectuals forced to use their talents for the state, the compromises they must make, and the subtle yet constant pressure to conform. It offers a complex portrait of the different ways people navigate to resist the system, from true believers to cynical opportunists to quiet dissidents. These novels are less explosive than Ivan Dissident, which was officially published. The Gulag Archipelago, which was not, were nevertheless deeply critical of Soviet life, censorship, and the pervasive atmosphere of fear and dishonesty. They circulated widely in samizdat before being published abroad, further solidifying Solzhenitsyn's reputation as a fearless truth-teller. Impact and exposure. Solzhenitsyn's works collectively achieved what decades of Western propaganda and academic analysis have struggled to do. They brought the lived reality of Soviet totalitarianism to sharp, undeniable focus for a global audience. His writing wasn't just political commentary, it was literature of immense power, grounded in personal suffering and a profound understanding of the human condition. He didn't just provide facts and figures. He told stories of individuals, making the abstract concept of repression terrifyingly concrete. Within the USSR, even after Ivan Dissident was suppressed, his other works circulating via samizdat and tamizdat were a vital source of alternative information and moral support for the burgeoning dissident movement. His courage inspired others. He became a symbol of resistance, a living embodiment of the principle that one could and must speak truth to power even when power held all the weapons. Globally, his works, particularly the Gulag Archipelago, had a profound impact on intellectual and political discourse. They significantly eroded the credibility of the Soviet Union and its apologists. For many, they confirmed the darkest suspicions about the nature of the communist state. They forced a reckoning, particularly among those in the West who had perhaps been too willing to overlook or rationalize the Soviet regime's crimes. The Nobel Prize in Literature he received in 1970 was not just for literary merit, but clearly also a recognition of his moral courage and global significance of his testimony. His life became a relentless struggle against the state that sought to silence him. Expelled from the Writers' Union in 1969, constantly harassed by the KGB. He refused to be broken. The publication of the Gulag Archipelago abroad sealed his fate in his homeland. In February 1974, he was arrested, charged with treason, stripped of his citizenship, and forcibly deported from the Soviet Union. Flown against his will to West Germany, he would spend the next 2 decades in exile, first in Europe and then in the United States, continuing to write and speak about the dangers of communism and the moral decay he saw in both the East and West. His life story, interwoven with the fabric of his extraordinary works, stands as a testament to the enduring power of literature to challenge tyranny and illuminate truth. The role of the dissident writer in Soviet society. All right, let's turn the page. We've introduced Solzhenitsyn, the man forged in the fire of the Gulag. But he wasn't an anomaly. He was perhaps the most famous, the most impactful. But he was part of a constellation of individuals who, through their art, their words, refused to submit to the state's narrative. We need to understand the environment in which these voices emerged, the immense pressures they faced, the unique role they played in a society built on control and concealment. In the Soviet Union, the writer was never just an artist. From the very beginning, the Bolshevik regime understood the power of ideas, the power of narrative. They sought to harness it entirely. Literature, like all art forms, was expected to serve the state, to build communism, to depict a glorious future, or at least a heroic present. This was the essence of socialist realism, not merely an artistic style, but a political directive. Any writing that deviated, questioned, that focused on the individual's suffering rather than the collective triumph was not just bad art, it was politically dangerous. The state didn't just want compliance, it demanded active participation in the lie. Writers were members of the Union of Soviet Writers, a powerful organization that controlled publishing, grants, housing, and travel. It was, in effect, an arm of the party, tasked with ensuring ideological purity among its members. Deviation could mean loss of livelihood, expulsion from the Union, and immediate descent to a world of suspicion and surveillance. Imagine your entire profession being controlled by the secret police. That was the reality. Mechanisms of control, censorship, surveillance, punishment. The machinery of control was intricate and pervasive. At the forefront was official censorship, managed by a body called Gavlet. Every book, every article, every play, every poem had to approve before publication or performance. Censors weren't just looking for overt criticism, they were trained to spot subtle implications, ambiguous phrases, anything that could be interpreted as straying from the official line, or, God forbid, revealing an inconvenient truth. The process was often arbitrary, maddeningly opaque, and constantly shifting based on the current party mood. This created an environment of crippling self censorship where writers learned to anticipate and internalize the state's prohibitions, often watering down their work before submitting it. But official censorship was only one layer. Underlying everything was constant state surveillance, primarily by the KGB. They monitored communications, opened mail, bugged apartments, cultivated informants among friends and colleagues, and maintained extensive files on anyone deemed potentially disloyal. For writers, especially those with any prominence or international contact, the scrutiny was intense. A misplaced word in a private conversation could find its way back to the authorities, leading to trouble. And the consequences for stepping out of line were severe and varied, designed to silence, isolate, and eliminate. The scale of punishment reflected the perceived threat. Blacklisting, the initial step. Your work simply wouldn't be published, performed, or discussed in the official press. You'd lose your job, your income, your standing in the writers' union, a slow, agonizing professional death. Expulsion from the writers' union, a formal declaration of pariah status, sealing the blacklisting and often making it impossible to find any work in the cultural sphere. Harassment and intimidation, constant summons for talks with the KGB, threats against family members, orchestrated campaigns of denigration in the official press, vandalism, and even physical assault. Forced psychiatric treatment, a particularly cruel tactic used against dissidents, including writers. Declaring them mentally ill for opposing the state was a way to delegitimize their views and confine them indefinitely in brutal psychiatric hospitals. often drugged and mistreated, imprisonment in the Gulag, the fate of Solzhenitsyn and countless others, arrests, sham trials, and sentencing to forced labor camps. The duration could be years, conditions horrific, designed to break the spirit and often the body. For many, it was a death sentence by slow starvation, exhaustion, or disease. Internal exile. After serving a sentence or as an alternative punishment, dissidents could be banished to remote parts of the country, cut off from their support networks or cultural life. Solzhenitsyn experienced this after the Gulag term. Forcible exile abroad, stripping individuals of citizenship and deporting them. This was the fate of Solzhenitsyn in 1974 and many others, including Joseph Brodsky. It removed them from the domestic scene, but often amplified their international voice. Execution, though less common for writers in the post-Stalin era than during the purges of the 1930s. The threat was always present. Dissidents were aware that their lives were at risk. These risks weren't just theoretical, they were the lived realities for writers like Solzhenitsyn, Varlam Sharlamov, author of the harrowing Kolyma tales, based on his 2 decades in the Gulag, Andrei Sinyavsky, and Yuli Daniel, who were given show trials and Gulag sentences for publishing anti-Soviet fiction abroad under pseudonyms in the mid-1960s, and poets like Anna Amatova and Osip Mandelstam, who suffered immense repression during the Stalin era, with Mandelstam dying in a transit camp. These were individuals who chose truth or artistic integrity over safety and comfort, often paying an unbearable price. Circulating the forbidden. Samizdat and Tamizdat. How then did forbidden writing find readers? This was where the ingenuity and courage of ordinary citizens came into play, creating parallel systems of circulation known as samizdat and tamizdat. Samizdat translate roughly as self-publishing. Since official presses were closed to dissenting voices, manuscripts were typed, retyped, carbon copied, often only legible through the first few copies, handwritten and passed from person to person. A single manuscript might be read by dozens, even hundreds, before it deteriorated or was confiscated. It wasn't just literary work. Samizdat included human rights reports, political essays, underground journals, religious texts, and even translations of foreign works. It was a slow, laborious, dangerous process, but it created an alternative information ecosystem, a vital intellectual and moral lifeline for those who rejected the state's lies. Samizdat was more than just a distribution method. It was a form of collective resistance. The act of copying, passing, and reading these forbidden texts created a community, a network of trust and shared risk. Solzhenitsyn's works, including parts of the Gulag Archipelago and novels like Cancer Ward and The First Circle, circulated widely in Samizdat for years before finding their way abroad. This underground circulation within the Soviet Union ensured that a core group of citizens knew the truth, even if official media ignored it. Tamizdat means publishing there, referring to the West. Manuscripts smuggled out of the Soviet Union were published by foreign presses. This was also a risky undertaking. Getting a manuscript out required trusting contacts, often foreigners, journalists, diplomats, academics, or defectors. Publication abroad immediately alerted the KGB to the existence of the work and its author, escalating the danger for the writer and anyone involved in getting the manuscript out or circulating it internally. But Tamizdat publication had immense power. It broke the state's monopoly on information. Works like the Gulag Archipelago, once published in the West, were broadcast back into the Soviet Union via foreign radio stations like Radio Liberty and Dutch Well. Though listening was risky and jamming frequent, this allowed Soviet citizens access to the works that exposed the regime's crimes on an international stage and often provided details about events or individuals that were suppressed domestically. Tamizdat created a crucial feedback loop, amplifying the voices of dissidents and making it harder for the state to simply make them disappear. Motivations, legacy, and impact. Given the extraordinary risks, what motivated these writers? It wasn't financial gain or popular acclaim within their homeland. These motivations were deeply moral and ethical. For Solzhenitsyn and others, it was a profound sense of responsibility to bear witness. Having experienced or seen the suffering inflicted by the state, They felt a moral imperative to record it, to remember the victims, and to prevent the truth from being erased by state propaganda. They saw rioting as a duty, a struggle against the enforced amnesia and historical revisionism of the regime. Another key motivation was the preservation of truth itself. In a system built on lies, articulating even a small truth felt like a powerful act of defiance. They believed that by speaking the truth about the past and the present, they could undermine the foundations of the totalitarian state. It was a belief in the eventual triumph of truth, however long it took. For many, it was also about retaining personal integrity and dignity. To remain silent for them was to become complicit in the regime's crimes. Rioting, even in secret, was a way of preserving one's inner freedom when physical freedom was denied. It was an assertion of individual conscience against the demands of the collective and state. The cultural impact within the Soviet Union was significant, albeit difficult to measure precisely. Samizdat works were passed among intellectuals, students, and anyone disillusioned with the official ideology. They provided alternative perspectives, historical accuracy where official history lied, and a sense that one was not alone in their dissent. This underground culture fostered critical thinking and helped sustain a sense of identity outside the state's control. Dissident writers became a moral authority, figures looked up to for their courage and unwavering commitment to truth. Internationally, the impact was arguably even more profound and tangible. Works like the Gulag Archipelago fundamentally altered global perceptions of the Soviet Union. They provided undeniable evidence of the regime's brutality and totalitarian nature, making it much harder for Western intellectuals and political figures to ignore or rationalize the human cost of communism. Solzhenitsyn's work, in particular, contributed significantly to the erosion of intellectual sympathy for the Soviet system in the West and armed anti-communist movements and policymakers with powerful moral arguments. The legacy of Soviet dissident writers is immense. They demonstrated the enduring power of the written word as a tool for resistance and truth-telling, even under the most extreme conditions. They left behind a body of literature that serves not only as a historical record of a dark era, but also as a universal testament to the human capacity for courage, resilience, and moral clarity in the face of tyranny. Their struggle highlights the crucial role of a free press and uncensored artistic expression in any healthy society. They remind us that sometimes the most powerful weapon against a wall of lies is a single bravely spoken truth. Musings, reflections on freedom, courage, and the power of words. The ash settles softly in the ashtray. A slow, deliberate curl of smoke traces ephemeral patterns in the air, soon to dissipate, leaving no trace. Like so many things, isn't it? Moments, words, lives, sometimes snuffed out, leaving only an echo in the memory, if even that. We spent some time navigating the stark, brutal landscape of Solzhenitsyn's reality, the physical and psychological architecture of the Gulag, the suffocating grip of a state terrified of unauthorized thought. It's easy to look back on such times, such places, as historical curiosities, relics of a bygone era we tell ourselves we've moved beyond. But the echo persists, don't they? The fundamental human equation of power, truth, fear, and defiance seems stubbornly constant. Sitting here in the quiet, a world away from the forced labor camps and the whispered samizdat, it's perhaps too easy to intellectualize the courage it took to read about it in a book or to hear about it in a podcast. But try just for a moment to inhabit that silence, the silence that wasn't empty, but filled with unspoken fear, the silence imposed by the state, demanding complicity, the silence born of knowing something forbidden, something dangerous, and wrestling with the impulse to speak it against the instinct for self-preservation. The weight of knowing, truth as a burden. Solzhenitsyn carried a heavy burden, the truth of the Gulag, not just the truth of his own suffering, but the collective systematized suffering of millions. Imagine living with that knowledge, that memory, in a society that actively denied it, erased it, punished anyone who dared whisper its name. The state built a towering edifice of lies, polished and presented as absolute reality. To see through that lie, to know the crumbling foundation beneath the shiny facade, was itself a dangerous act, and to feel compelled to articulate that knowledge, that required a different order of strength. We talk about speaking truth to power rather casually these days. It's become a slogan, a comfortable idea. But in a place and time like the Soviet Union, power didn't just issue reprimands or ignore you. It crushed you. It made you disappear. It broke your body. It tried to break your spirit. Truth wasn't just a different perspective. It was sedition. And the act of writing, preserving that truth, of giving it form and substance, was an act of war against the state that controlled the very definition of reality. Consider the physical act, writing in secret on scraps of paper, burying manuscripts, memorizing entire passages to protect them from discovery. It wasn't romantic, it was painstaking, nerve-wracking labor, carried out in the shadows of constant surveillance. Every sentence was a risk, every page a potential indictment. This wasn't writing for publication in the conventional sense. It was writing for preservation, for memory, for the slim hope that someday someone somewhere would read it and know. It was an act of faith in the eventual triumph of reality over forced illusion. The paradox is stark. The state's immense power was, in part, built on its ability to control narrative, to lie convincingly and universally. Yet a single individual, armed with nothing but memory, integrity, and a pen, could pose a genuine threat to that power structure, simply by refusing to participate in the lie. Solzhenitsyn's writings, particularly the Gulag Archipelago, were not just books, they were detonations. They exploded the state's narrative from within, not with bombs, but with facts, with testimony, with the undeniable weight of human experience. Loneliness in the inner citadel. Being a dissident, particularly in a totalitarian regime, is an inherently lonely path. You are often isolated, cut off from friends who fear association, shunned by institutions, living in perpetual suspicion. The state works not just to punish, but to isolate, to make the individual feel utterly alone against the monolithic power of the collective. Solzhenitsyn experienced this acutely, both within the camps and later under surveillance and in exile. The courage required isn't just the bravery to face physical threats, though that is immense. It's the courage to withstand isolation, to trust your own judgment when the entire world around you insists you are wrong or mad or an enemy. It's the courage to maintain your moral compass when compromise seems the only rational path to survival. Solzhenitsyn, in his writing and in his life, often spoke about the importance of not participating in the lie, even in small ways. This refusal to compromise, to bend to the prevailing falsehood, was a source of inner strength, but also a barrier between him and those who found ways to accommodate themselves to the system. This brings us to the concept of the inner citadel, that space within the individual mind and spirit that remains free, even when the body is imprisoned. For Solzhenitsyn, writing became the construction of this citadel. While physically confined, his mind was traveling across the vast archipelago of the Gulag, gathering stories, assembling facts, building his monumental testament to suffering and resistance. This inner work was a form of freedom the state could not entirely confiscate, though they tried desperately. But maintaining that inner freedom came at a cost. It required a fierce, sometimes unforgiving, commitment to principle. It meant seeing the moral compromises others made and judging them, perhaps silently, perhaps openly. This judgment, born of his own unwavering stance, sometimes made him a difficult, even prickly figure. Later in life, as well as during the Soviet era, the loneliness of the dissidents isn't just imposed by the state. It can also be a consequence of their own uncompromising moral clarity, which sets them apart from the crowd. The paradoxes of power and resistance. Totalitarian power at its core is deeply insecure. It seeks total control precisely because it fears dissent, fears truth, fears the individual's capacity for independent thought. It's a system built on a fundamental lie that the party, the state, embodies the collective will and historical inevitability, while the individual is merely a cog. The more the state insists on its absolute power, the more it reveals its vulnerability to anything that exposes its artificiality. A single book, a single voice, can become a focal point for resistance, not because it has physical power, but because it speaks to a reality the state denies. Resonating with the unarticulated experiences and frustrations of the population. Consider the Soviet state's reaction to Solzhenitsyn. After the brief, ill-fated official publication of Ivan Dezinovich, they recognized the danger. They moved to suppress him, expel him, harass him, eventually deport him. Why devote such immense resources to the KGB, the propaganda apparatus, to silencing one writer? Because they understood the potential power of his words. They knew that if his truth took root, it could dismantle their carefully constructed world. Their extreme reaction was an inadvertent testament to his power. By making him a pariah, they made him a symbol, and the paradox extends to exile. They expelled him to silence him domestically, to remove him from the Soviet scene, but by doing so, they catapulted him onto the world stage. The Gulag Archipelago, published in the West, became a global phenomenon reaching millions, including via radio broadcast, penetrating back into the very country that exiled its author. His voice, though removed geographically, became louder, amplified by the international reaction and the clear injustice of his treatment. The state's ultimate tool of silencing became, ironically, a means of amplifying his message globally. The power of the tyrant, absolute as it may seem, relies on the complicity or silence of the many. It relies on the widespread acceptance, or at least the outward performance, of the lie. The resistance of the dissident, conversely, relies on the quiet recognition of the truth by the few, which can eventually spread. It's a battle fought not with armies, but in the hearts and minds of individuals. Solzhenitsyn's victory, if one can call it that, wasn't achieved through political maneuvering or armed struggle, but through the unwavering assertion of reality, documented and presented with undeniable moral force. Reflecting on our own freedoms. This contemplation of Solzhenitsyn's struggle inevitably turns the lens back upon ourselves. We who live in societies where freedom of expression is, for the most part, taken for granted. We can write, publish, speak, protest, criticize our leaders, mock our institutions, often with little fear of state reprisal, certainly not imprisonment or exile. Does this freedom, so hard won and absent in Solzhenitsyn's world, diminish the importance of truth-telling? Or does it increase our responsibility? When the state doesn't force us into silence, what explains our own? Why do we self-censor? Why do we sometimes choose comfortable narratives over uncomfortable truths? Why do we occasionally find ourselves participating, however passively, in smaller, softer lies? Not lies of the scale of the Gulag, perhaps, but lies nonetheless. In our public discourse, in our understanding of history, in our interactions with each other. Solzhenitsyn's life is a potent reminder that freedom is not merely the absence of state oppression, it is also an internal state, a willingness to see clearly, to think independently, and to speak honestly. Even when it is difficult or unpopular, it is a constant negotiation between the desire for comfort and conformity and the imperative of integrity and truth. His story challenges us to consider what we would do if our freedoms were curtailed, but it also subtly asks, what are we doing with the freedoms we already possess? Are we using our voices, our platforms, however small, to push back against falsehoods, to highlight injustice, to preserve inconvenient truths? Or are we allowing the noise of the modern world, the distractions, the pressures to conform, to achieve a different kind of silence? A silence born not of state terror, but of apathy, comfort, or fear of social disapproval. The world is complex. The lines between truth and falsehood can be blurred by intention, by perspective, by the sheer volume of information. But Solzhenitsyn navigated a landscape where the lie was not subtle, it was foundational. His response was not complex. It was a radical commitment to reality. His work stands as a testament to the power of that commitment and a stark warning about the consequences when societies lose their grip on the truth. His struggles against censorship, surveillance, imprisonment, exile underscore the value of the rights we often overlook. They were fighting for the right to publish a word, to tell a story, to remember a name, rights we exercise countless times a day, without a second thought. His courage highlights the potential cost of these rights, and perhaps, by contrast, the potential feebleness of our own engagement when the stakes seem lower. So the music continues, the smoke rises, twists, fades. The questions remain. What is the weight of the truth you carry? What is the cost of the silence you keep? What are you building in the quiet corners of your own mind that no external force can ever take away? Before we continue our exploration of Solzhenitsyn's indelible impact, let me draw your attention to something else that speaks to endurance, craft, and legacy, the timeless creation of Leek furniture makers. Leek's approach is a meditation in wood and craftsmanship. Each piece is not merely furniture, but a tale carved in grain, a legacy shaped by hands dedicated to quality and tradition. Just as Solzhenitsyn's writings carry the weight of history and human resilience, Leek's furniture embodies the spirit of lasting beauty, thoughtfully designed to become part of your life's narrative. With an unwavering commitment to artisanal detail, Leek transforms wood into sanctuary, places where ideas flourish and reflection deepens. Their collections blend enduring design with subtle elegance, inviting you to create rooms that nurture contemplation, creativity, and calm. It's furniture that doesn't simply fill a space, but enriches it, much like a great book enriches the mind. For those who appreciate the intersection of tradition and timelessness, Leek furniture makers offer more than just utility, they offer heritage. Visit their showroom or online today and discover how their pieces can turn your living space into a quiet refuge, an invitation to pause and ponder, much like our literary journey here. As we ponder the power of the written word, consider the tools that accompany those movements of reflection and creativity. Enter the moleskin notebook, more than just paper bound in covers. It's a storied companion for thinkers, creators, and truth seekers throughout history, with a legacy that traces back to the legendary notebook carried by artists like Picasso and writers such as Hemingway. Moleskine embodies a tradition of persevering and preserving ideas that demand to be remembered. This meticulously crafted quality paper, smooth to the touch, invites every pen stroke with encouragement rather than resistance. The minimalist design, durable cover, and elastic band closure make the notebook both practical and elegant, perfect for capturing fleeting thoughts, detailed observations, or those musings that linger at the edges of consciousness. One can imagine dissidents like Alexandr Solzhenitsyn quietly preserving forbidden truths on scraps of paper, the words of lifeline in dark times. While few of us face such dire stakes, the impulse to record our own stories, our own reflections, share. A moleskin notebook invites you to continue this tradition, whether chronicling your daily observation, sketching ideas, or simply making sense of the chaos one page at a time. For those who cherish the written word as a vessel of freedom, memory, and creativity, the moleskin notebook is an ideal companion. Why not begin your own archive of thought today? The ash continues to quiet its quiet descent. We've traversed the archipelago of lies, the gulag built on suppressed truth. We've witnessed the forced forging of a voice in that inferno. Now we turn our attention to the aftermath. The Soviet Union, that monolithic structure Solzhenitsyn did so much to expose, and some argue to help dismantle ideologically, finally crumbled. What becomes of the prophet when the temple he railed against collapses? What was Solzhenitsyn's role, his influence, his legacy, in the confusing, tumultuous years that followed? For 2 decades, from 1974 to 1994, Solzhenitsyn lived in exile, first briefly in Europe, then settling with his family in Cavendish, Vermont, a quiet, isolated corner of the United States. He remained prolific during this time, working tirelessly on his epic historical cycle, The Red Wheel, a multi-volume fictionalized account of the events leading up to and during the Russian Revolution. He also continued to speak out against the Soviet regime and, increasingly, to critique aspects of Western society he found lacking: its materialism, its moral compromises, its perceived lack of spiritual depth. While in exile, his status in the West was complex. He was initially hailed as a hero, a moral titan who stood against an evil empire. The Gulag Archipelago became essential reading for anyone wanting to understand the true nature of the Soviet state. But over time, his strong Russian nationalist views, his deep Orthodox Christian faith, and his sometimes harsh critiques of Western liberalism alienated some who had previously championed him. He was not interested to be a simple poster child for Western democracy. He was fundamentally Russian, deeply rooted in its history and culture, and a vision for its future was his own. Return to a changed Russia. Then came 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved. The state had stripped Solzhenitsyn of his citizenship and banished him, ceased to exist. For years, there was a speculation about whether he would return. Could the great accuser of the Soviet system find a place in the new Russia? In 1994, he did. His return was itself a carefully orchestrated piece of symbolism. He chose not to fly directly to Moscow. Instead, he flew to Vladivostok in the Russian Far East. There, he embarked on a months-long journey across the vast Russian landscape by train, retracing in reverse the path taken by so many prisoners on their way to the Gulag camps in Siberia. It was a pilgrimage, a reconnection with the land and its people, a deliberate act of witnessing the state of a post-Soviet Russia firsthand. Along the way, he met authority citizens, local officials, and intellectuals, observing, listening, and forming his judgments about the new reality. His arrival back in Moscow was a major event, greeted with significant media attention. He was formally reinstated as a citizen and awarded the State Prize of Russian Federation in 1990. Before his return, a symbolic gesture by the new Russian government acknowledging his historical importance and suffering. He was welcomed back, seemingly as a national prophet. However, the Russia he returned to was vastly different from the one he had left. It was grappling with chaotic economic reforms, rising crime and corruption, a weakening of central authority, and a profound identity crisis after decades of Soviet rule. While his name was known, and his status as a symbol of anti-Soviet resistance was acknowledged, the depth of his ideas, particularly his later ones, did not always resonate with the population focused on daily survival and navigating the new capitalist reality. Later works and public stances in post-Soviet Russia. Upon his return, Solzhenitsyn did not retreat into quiet retirement. He remained an active, albeit controversial, public figure. He was granted a television program where he spoke directly to the Russian people, offering his often unvarnished views on the new state of the nation. His major work from this period is a two-volume book, 200 Years Together, 2001, which examines the history of Jews in Russia and the Soviet Union since the late 18th century. This work, intended by Solzhenitsyn to be an objective historical account aimed at fostering understanding between Russians and Jews, proved highly controversial. Critics accused him of downplaying or excusing Russian anti-Semitism and focusing disproportionately on the role of the Jews in revolutionary movements in the Soviet state apparatus. Supporters defended it as a courageous attempt to address a sensitive historical issue, albeit from a particular perspective. The controversy highlighted the complex and often uncomfortable nature of his historical and national views. He also published works like Russia in Collapse, 1998, a collection of essays sharply critical of the reforms implemented by Boris Yeltsin's government. Solzhenitsyn viewed the Russian transition to capitalism and democracy as disastrous, leading to widespread corruption, inequality, and a loss of national purpose. He criticized the selling off of state assets, the rise of oligarchs, and the perceived subservience of the new Russian government to Western influence. His vision for Russia was more traditional, leaning towards a form of rooted, localized self-government, Zemsky Sobor, rather than the Western-style liberal democracy, which he saw as having its own forms of spiritual emptiness and overreach. His public persona in Russia was that of a stern, moralistic figure, respected by some for his past courage, but increasingly seen by others as out of touch with the realities of the new Russia, or overly nationalistic. His television program, while initially popular, was eventually canceled, reportedly due to low ratings, suggesting his message didn't resonate as widely with the general population as it did with intellectual circles. He did, however, gain favor with Vladimir Putin, who became president in 2000. Putin, who represented a move towards restoring stronger state authority after the perceived chaos over the Yeltsin years, expressed admiration for Solzhenitsyn as a national figure and patriot. Solzhenitsyn, in turn, seemed to view Putin, initially at least, as potentially capable of restoring order and strength to Russia, though he did not shy away from criticizing certain government actions or policies when he felt it necessary. This relationship further complicated his image, particularly in the West, where Putin was viewed increasingly critically. Solzhenitsyn passed away in 2008 at the age of 89. His death was marked by national mourning in Russia, and he was buried with state honors, a final ironic twist for the man who had spent decades as the state's most prominent enemy. His journey had taken him from prisoner to exile to national icon, though the nature of that icon status remained contested. Controversies and complexity of that legacy. Assessing Solzhenitsyn's legacy requires confronting its complexities. While his role in exposing the Gulag and the nature of the Soviet totalitarianism is universally acknowledged and monumental, his later views and certain aspects of his earlier writings have generated significant debate and criticism. One area of major controversy, as mentioned, is his treatment of Jewish history in Russia. 200 years together, critics argue that the book perpetuated harmful stereotypes and focused excessively on the involvement of individuals of Jewish origin in the Bolshevik Party and the state security apparatus. If you want my honest opinion of that, that shit's kind of deserved. Like, like that demographic had a fucking lot to do with communism in both Russia and communism abroad. Solzhenitsyn still matter today, beyond the historical context of the Soviet Union. Unequivocally, yes, his ideas continue to resonate globally, particularly in discussions about human rights, the nature of state power, and his essential role of literature and truth in confronting authoritarianism. His analysis of that gulag was not just about Soviet camps, it was a profound exploration of the mechanisms of totalitarian power, the deliberate destruction of the individual, the use of fear and lies to control populations, the creation of parallel realities, and the erosion of moral norms under systemic pressure. These themes are frighteningly relevant today, not just in countries with overtly authoritarian regimes, but also in more democratic societies, grappling with the issues of state surveillance, the manipulation of information, the rise of populism, and the challenges to fundamental human rights. His insistence on the importance of not participating in lie is a powerful ethical principle that transcends the Soviet context. In an era of widespread disinformation, propaganda from states and non-state actors, and the blurring of lines between fact and opinion, Solzhenitsyn's call for individuals to maintain their integrity by refusing to echo falsehoods, however small, is a vital message. It's a call to personal responsibility in upholding truth, even when challenging dominant narratives is difficult or carries social, professional, or even physical risks. His work underscores the vulnerability of truth in the face of organized state power and the critical need for institutions and individuals willing to defend it. His writings are a stark reminder of what happens when checks and balances fail, when human rights are ignored, and when the state places itself above morality and truth. His experiences highlight the crucial role of international awareness and solidarity in supporting those who speak out against repression. Moreover, Solzhenitsyn's life and work remain a touchstone for understanding the role of dissident literature. He elevated personal testimony and moral witness into a high art. His example continues to inspire writers, journalists, and activists in various parts of the world who are confronting censorship, persecution, and state violence. His story demonstrates that literature can be more than just entertainment or aesthetic expression. It can be a powerful act of bearing witness, a vehicle for historical memory, and a force of moral clarity in a confused or oppressive time. Dissident literature, in its various forms today, owes a significant debt to the path forged by Solzhenitsyn and others like him. His emphasis on memory, the imperative to remember the victims, to remember the crimes, to remember the truth of history, is also incredibly relevant. Authoritarian regimes thrive on historical amnesia and revisionism. Solzhenitsyn's monumental effort to document the Gulag was an explicit act of defiance against this structure. In contemporary global contexts, where historical narratives are often contested, weaponized, or suppressed, the need to confront difficult truths about the past, just as Solzhenitsyn did, remains paramount. His work also offers a cautionary tale about the seductive nature of ideology and the dangers of utopian thinking that justifies immense human suffering in pursuit of an abstract future goal. While this primary target is communism, his critiques of totalitarian logic and the devaluing of individual human life for the sake of the collective or the state have broader applicability. The enduring fight against authoritarianism. Ultimately, Solzhenitsyn's legacy is inextricably linked to the ongoing global struggle against authoritarianism. While the Soviet Union is gone, the specter of unchecked state power, surveillance, censorship, and suppression of dissidents persist in many forms across the world, from digital censorship of the internet to the imprisonment of journalists and writers. The challenges faced by those who speak truth to power echo today in different registers, the struggles Solzhenitsyn knew. His work provides a vocabulary, a framework, and a profound moral argument for understanding and resisting such systems. It reminds us that the fight for freedom and human dignity is not just political or economic. It is deeply moral and often begins with the individual's refusal to compromise with falsehood. His unwavering commitment to truth, forged in the darkest pits of the Gulag, stand as beacons for those who continue to fight today, reminding them of the potential impact of a single voice, a single story, a single truth bravely told. His legacy is not simple. It contains contradictions, difficult truths, and points of contention, but the core remains a testament to the power of courage, the resilience of the human spirit, and the indispensable role of literature in bearing witness to history and upholding fundamental moral values in the face of tyranny. The Gulag may be gone, but the lessons of Solzhenitsyn taught us about the human condition and the nature of oppressive power remain vital for understanding our own world. The quiet returns, setting like dust motes in the sunbeam. We've walked a long road, haven't we? Traversed the harsh terrain of the Gulag, navigated the treacherous currents of Soviet control, and witnessed the life and work of a man who dared to speak when silence was the price of survival. Alexandr Solzhenitsyn, his name now perhaps echoes differently in your mind than it did an hour ago. Less a historical footnote, and perhaps, maybe more, a presence, a challenge. We begin by asking about the dissident writer, the role of literature in a silenced world. Solzhenitsyn's life provides a searing, unforgettable answer. It tells us that in the face of organized, systematic falsehood, literature, or simply the act of bearing witness through words, can become a fundamental act of resistance. It can be a repository of memory, a validation of suffering, a defiant assertion of truth against an all encompassing lie. His story forces us to confront the very nature of reality, and who gets to define it. The weight of witness, courage, and integrity. Consider the courage. We've spoken of it, but can we truly grasp it? Not the fleeting bravery of a single dangerous moment, but the sustained, grinding courage required to live under perpetual threat, to work in secret for years, knowing that discovery could mean not just your end, but the end of truth you carry. Solzhenitsyn knew this. His manuscripts were hidden, entrusted to others at great risk. He memorized thousands of lines of prose and poetry when writing was just too dangerous. This wasn't just writing, it was safeguarding, like hiding precious jewels from thieves. The courage was not only physical, though surviving the Gulag and enduring the KGB harassment demanded immense physical and mental fortitude. It was a profound moral courage, the courage to refuse to participate in the lie. Solzhenitsyn spoke about this as the most important stand an individual could take in a society where saying yes to falsehood, however small, smoothed the path. The refusal to lie, to echo propaganda, to deny what you knew to be true was revolutionary. It was a decision to preserve one's inner integrity, that inner citadel we discussed, even when the external world was entirely controlled by oppressive forces. This is perhaps one of the most enduring and challenging lessons of Solzhenitsyn's life for us today. His world was one of stark, unambiguous lie, imposed by a totalitarian state. Our world is different. Lies are often more subtle, truth is often contested, and information warfare is conducted through complex, diffuse channels. Yet the core principle remains the personal responsibility to seek and uphold truth, and the quiet erosion of integrity that comes from accepting or repeating what one knows to be false, whether for comfort, convenience, or social acceptance. Solzhenitsyn's stand wasn't just about fighting communism, it was about the universal human struggle to maintain moral clarity in a world that pressures us to compromise. It was a testament to the power of individual conscience, that stubborn, unyielding core that refuses to bend even when everything else is yielding. He showed us that integrity is not passive, it is an active, ongoing choice, often made in loneliness and isolation. Words, vessels of truth, engines of change. And what of the words themselves? For Solzhenitsyn, words were not merely tools of communication, they were vessels carrying the weight of lived experience, the burden of historical truth, and the potential for moral reflection and rectification. His prose in the Gulag Archipelago is often raw, stark, imbued with righteous power and profound sorrow. It is designed not just to inform, but to make the reader feel the crushing reality of the system, see the faces of the millions who vanished. His most famous work didn't rely on abstract arguments against communism. It relied on the overwhelming accumulation of detailed, horrifying testimony. It was the power of storytelling, of individual human voices raised against the state's attempt to silence them collectively. He turned the scattered, suppressed experiences of millions into a single thunderous indictment delivered to the conscience of the world. The sheer act of compiling, organizing, and writing down these truths transformed them from fragmented whispers to an undeniable roar. Literature, in Solzhenitsyn's hands, became an engine of change, not through political manifestos, but through the assertion of human reality. By depicting the Gulag, he didn't just criticize the Soviet state, he delegitimized it at its very core. He showed that a system built on such immense suffering and widespread lies could not claim moral authority or historical inevitability. His words chipped away at the foundations of the empire of lies, piece by painful piece. This underscores the profound power that words still hold. In an age saturated with information, often superficial or manipulated, the carefully chosen word, the well crafted sentence, the sustained narrative that speaks truth to complexity or injustice retains its potential force. Solzhenitsyn reminds us that words can educate, they can expose, they can connect people across vast distances and experiences, and they can inspire action or, at the very least, indispensable reflection. But words can also be fragile. They can be suppressed, twisted, drowned out by noise. The ease with which information flows today can sometimes blind us to the deliberate efforts in many parts of the world and in different forms to control narratives, suppressing dissenters' voices, and rewrite history. Solzhenitsyn's struggle is a potent reminder that the fight for the free circulation of truth is never definitively won. It requires constant vigilance and renewed effort, legacy and relevance in our time. Solzhenitsyn's legacy is complex, as any profound human legacy is. His later political and historical views sparked debate and disagreement. They continue to do so. He was not simply a figurehead for any for any single ideology, but a deeply rooted Russian thinker whose experience led him to conditions that were sometimes uncomfortable for both East and West. But regardless of one's argument or agreement with these perspectives, his central achievement stands the dismantling of the Soviet narrative surrounding the Gulag, and by extension the nature of the Soviet state, through the sheer moral force of testimony and literary skill. His relevance today extends far beyond the specific historical context of the Soviet Union. Wherever power seeks to silence truth, wherever states or other powerful actors attempt to control information or dictate reality, Solzhenitsyn's work remains a vital reference point. It provides a framework for understanding the mechanisms of oppression and the human cost of totalitarian ambitions. It highlights the vulnerability of societies that allow lies to become foundational. More personally, his life challenges us to think about our own relationship with truth and freedom. We who live in the relatively free societies are not asked to face the KGB for writing uncomfortable truths, but are we using the freedom we have? Are we engaging quickly with the information that we receive? Are we contributing to a culture where truth is valued and sought, even when it's convenient? Are we allowing ourselves to be swept along by currents of misinformation, groupthink, or comfortable denial? Solzhenitsyn's experience is a powerful prompt to examine our own complicity, however small, in the propagation or acceptance of falsehoods in our own sphere. His story also reminds us the precociousness of freedoms we could possess, the freedoms to read, to write, to speak, to question and remember. These were the very freedoms that Solzhenitsyn and other dissidents risked everything to claim. often through clandestine means like samizdat and tamizdat. The struggle serves as a potent reminder that these are not abstract rights, but vital necessities for a healthy society and a dignified individual life. They are not a given. They require active defense and mindful exercise. A call to thoughtful engagement. So where does that leave us? Sitting here in the quiet, long after Solzhenitsyn endured the camps and spoke his truth to the world, it leaves us, as I believe, with the responsibility to remember the millions who suffered and perished in the Gulag, whose voices were silenced, and whose memory Solzhenitsyn sought to preserve. His work is a monument to them, and engaging with it is an act of honoring their lives and their suffering. It leaves us with the responsibility to engage with history, particularly the difficult, uncomfortable parts that powerful forces might prefer us to forget, to engage with literature that challenges us, that expands our understanding of the human condition, and that bears witness to realities outside our own experience. Solzhenitsyn's work are not easy reads, but they are necessary ones. They demand our attention, our empathy, and our serious reflection. It leaves us with the responsibility to ourselves to cultivate the inner citadel of integrity, that commitment to truth that Solzhenitsyn exemplified, to resist the pressures, external and internal, to participate in lies or to remain silent when truth demands to be spoken. This doesn't necessarily mean dramatic public acts, though for some it might, but it means a quiet, consistent commitment in our own lives, in our own conversations, in how we choose to inform ourselves, and how we choose to use our own words. Solzhenitsyn's world was one of overwhelming state power and brutal repression. His victory was not a political overthrow, but a moral and intellectual one, the assertion of truth against a lie, the preservation of human dignity in dehumanizing conditions. His story is somber, filled with pain and loss, yet is profoundly hopeful in demonstrating the resilience of the human spirit, hopeful in showing that even the most powerful totalitarian regimes can be undermined by the simple, courageous act of speaking and preserving truth, hopeful in reminding us that individuals armed with integrity and conviction can indeed make a difference, can shift the currents of history, can ensure that the echoes of suffering are not lost to silence. Let the musing continue beyond this hour. Let Solzhenitsyn's voice, echoing from the archipelago, serve not as a historical curiosity, but as a vital prompt for our own lives, a prompt to look closely, to think deeply, to speak honestly, and to cherish and defend the freedoms that make such truth-telling possible. Let us carry forward the understanding that words matter, that truth is fragile but powerful, and that the courage to stand apart from the lie is a cornerstone of human dignity and resilience. That's all for this hour. I'm the cigarette smoking man. Thanks for being here with me tonight. We're gonna win.